Hello, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of Her Power 2021, Foreign Policy's flagship annual Global Women's Summit. My name is Diana Marrero. I'm the SVP of Strategic Development here at Foreign Policy, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today. Her Power first launched in 2019, gathering amazing leaders together in Washington, D.C. for a day of connection, mentorship, and growth. In 2020, we all saw the world shift to digital and took the challenge to expand our reach with thousands of people registered from all over the world. And now we're back for our third year to amplify global voices that are imperative in the fight for equality for women. On yesterday's program, we heard from inspiring leaders like Melinda French Gates, Vera Sangwe, the Honorable Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, former president of Liberia, and many others. Important themes emerged in these conversations. Our speakers shed light on the many barriers women and girls continue to face in 2021, but they also shared practical solutions and ideas for including women at the table and how gender equity can benefit all of us, women and men, girls and boys. I want to take a moment to thank all of our partners who have helped make this event possible, the collective of the 5 Nordic embassies, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, ASU's Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, ASU's Thunderbird School of Global Management, Ethique, Hologic, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And now a few housekeeping items. We have a diverse audience from all over the world tuned in for this event here on our virtual event platform, as well as on social media watching our live stream, and we want to hear from you. So for those of you who are logged in to our event webpage, please remember to submit your questions via the question box below at foreignpolicy.com/events to the right of the video player on your screen. And we will try to include as many audience questions as possible during our live sessions. And if you're joining us on social media, please chime in on the conversation using the hashtag HerPower2021. Let's make sure this conversation is heard far and wide. Like yesterday, at the end of today's plenary program, we'll be hosting a series of interactive breakout sessions where you can interact with the speakers and moderators, ask questions, make comments. You can review the agenda for topics we'll cover, from climate change to women and technology to fighting gender-based violence. Space is limited, but links will be posted on this platform as breakout sessions go live. So please be sure to stick around and join us this afternoon at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. All right, let's dive right in. Foreign Policy's executive editor, Amelia Lester, sat down with former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, for an important conversation on how New Zealand is handling the COVID-19 pandemic and her role at the United Nations Development Program, as well as challenges facing women and the way that they overcome those challenges, especially in politics. So after the Prime Minister's conversation with Amelia Lester, executive editor at FP, we'll be joined by Maggie Lake, a veteran journalist and moderator, for the next couple of sessions. So please enjoy our opening keynote conversation for day 2 of Her Power 2021.
Let's start with COVID. With Helen Johnson Sirleaf, you chaired the UN's independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response this past year, and you reported to the World Health Assembly on lessons learned. What, in your view, united the responses by countries who were successful in their handling of the pandemic?
Number one rule for success is don't deny science and what it's telling you. Don't deny public health advice. Just get the best advice you can, make good judgments from that, and communicate so clearly with your publics. There's been a lot of discussion about how well, on average, the women leaders around the world did. And think of leaders like Angela Merkel, herself a scientist, a rigorous physicist, took on board the evidence, acted on it, and was a trusted figure as well. In my own country, Jacinda Ardern, superb communicator, the Scandinavian democracies with the number of women leaders there. And so it went by and large around the world. I think it also helps that by and large the women have less ego. They're more coming at the job, task focused, wanting to serve the public interest, not populists, can't find a populist among them. And they made good decisions. This is tough. we're dealing with a novel coronavirus, which 2 years ago we knew nothing about. And we've had to scramble with this huge impact on our societies, communities, economies, geopolitics. It's been a shocker, but the women have done rather well.
And you mentioned the importance of trusting the science, but also that we didn't know anything about this 2 years ago. So, of course, our understanding of the science shifted. And I wanted to talk to you particularly about the travel restrictions, because I know you've spoken out about the need to rethink those. And you said that countries that banned travel from China early on were right to do so. But, of course, early in the pandemic, we had public health experts and the World Health Organization saying that countries shouldn't use travel bans, and that often there was a sense that they were being used by particular governments as a kind of regressive means of closing off immigration and other influx of people into countries. So can you talk a bit about why you think that was the initial view and how we can ensure measures like closed borders that are so essential to curbing the pandemic don't lead to a permanently closed off world?
At the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response, we drew the conclusion that the international health regulations of 2005 were a hindrance and not a help in fighting the pandemic. One of the points those regulations make is that there should not be, quote, undue restrictions on travel. Well, in 2005, you didn't have anything like the scale of global travel that you had by the beginning of 2020. And all I can say for my own country, and looking at Australia across the way, 1,200 miles away, if we hadn't stopped travel from the immediately affected areas in early February, we would have been in as much of a mess as much of the Northern Hemisphere eventually got itself into. So we think the international health regulations need to be revamped to bring us up to date with the modern age. Not the only thing they need to be revamped on, by the way. They don't empower WHO. WHO needs to be able to get to the site of a disease outbreak with pandemic potential immediately. That didn't happen. It needs to be able to publish information it gets immediately, not having to wait for countries to agree. It needs to be able to act in a precautionary manner when you have a respiratory pathogen on the move. It feels constrained in doing that by the international health regulations. So when you hear calls for new legal instruments and empowering the WHO, these are kind of the areas that the new initiatives need to get into.
I'd like to talk a little bit next about the United Nations Development Programme, of which you were the first woman leader. Of course, we've all been watching Afghanistan in recent months as the Taliban has taken over again, and they've announced that modern education is essentially of no use. Education had been considered one of the successes of the aid-funded years following the Taliban's last period of rule. And it really was. I mean, last year the World Bank said that half of girls in the country were in school, and almost 70% of boys were in school. So my question now is, do you have hope that these reforms, that all these kids in school are going to plant the seeds for change in the long run? And what else can be done for Afghanistan's girls at this stage?
I'm weeping for Afghanistan, as I guess so many are. I was really quite connected with the affairs of the country going back to 2001, as just before the Taliban were pushed out of government, which was after 9/11, I took a decision with my government to allow many people from a boat of asylum seekers, which was blocked by Australia, to come to New Zealand, and I've retained associations with the Hazara families from that doomed vessel to this day. So I've been to Kabul and Bamiyan, I've been to Herat, I've been around, and I've seen the ups and downs of the last 20 years, not smooth, and the changes by no means reached the furthest corners of the land. Look, 2 years ago, I was on the outskirts of Herat and a province to the north of there. Go even just to the outskirts of the city and you see the little girls at 12 years old who are up on the marriage market because it's an economic asset to a very poor family which can't pay the rent. So things were progressing, but they hadn't reached everyone. And maybe the fact that development wasn't reaching everyone is also part of the reason why the Taliban could continue to get support in the rural areas, and it's essentially a movement that's coming out of there. So what on earth to do now? Look, the world has to keep pressing for the Taliban to uphold basic rights. The Security Council spoke on that, and one of the basic rights is the right to education, and we have to hang out for that. Without the Taliban conceding these basic rights, longer term, and maybe even medium term, I don't think, bold statement, their rule is sustainable because the human spirit has a quench for knowledge. It has a quench for personal advancement. It doesn't want to be cast in a medieval mode if there's a choice, apart from the most committed zealots. So what I am very concerned about is that we're now seeing the normal CNN effect with major events. You know, for a while there it was all go, right? It was wall-to-wall Afghanistan coverage, particularly when the West was evacuating those that it had contacts with. How often do you see Afghanistan leading CNN or the other channels today? Not much. I notice when I put material on social media, what's hot and what's not, it's hard to attract much interest or a tweet on Afghanistan today. Hey, you know, there's upwards of 35, 36 million people there who can't leave, who probably don't want to leave their homeland in any case, but they're having to live this experience. We can't walk away from them. We can't walk away from those girls who had a chance at education and are now hiding at home because the Taliban say you can't go to school. We have to hang in there for them and for everyone who's now being oppressed and persecuted. So it is a desperate situation.
You mentioned that development didn't reach everyone. I think something that was shocking when the US withdrawal happened was it revealed just how shallow that progress actually must have been. And the question is why? The US is there for 20 years, so much money. Was the problem a lack of money, or what was the problem? Why didn't development reach everyone?
I've got a couple of takes on that. One, I don't think Afghanistan's development was ever a 20-year project, even to the extent it was a project, and I'll come back to that. You know, Afghanistan is one of the world's poorest countries, a landlocked developing country, least developed country. It's been fought over down through the millennia, and the deep development challenges that it has, they're not the work of even the most committed 20 years. This is a very long-term support and solidarity initiative to support Afghanistan's people from where they are to where that they could be. And look at the examples of, quote, development successes around the world. Who would have thought that war-torn Korea close to 70 years ago would be, the economic and social status that it has today. So that's the first thing. Just even thinking in 20 years is not sensible. But secondly, I think that the intervention there clearly lacked a clear vision for development. It became more about sort of blocking terrorists than about, hey, how would you support and enable Afghans to lead on their own development, to define their own objectives, and do the long-term hard yards which turns the society around. And the basics of that are the human development. And if you haven't reached schooling to every child, if you haven't reached safe birthing to every woman, if you haven't found a way of supporting families to sustain livelihoods through the recurrent droughts, you have a very precarious basis for development. Let's face it, the West spent vastly more on its own military in Afghanistan than it ever spent on development. If what had been spent on the militaries over the last 20 years had gone into education and health and rural livelihoods and disaster resilience, of course, the last 20 years would have had a different outcome too.
You're the three-time Prime Minister of New Zealand, you're the second woman Prime Minister of that country, and you were a member of the Council of Women World Leaders. That was an international network of current and former women presidents and prime ministers. You've also been in the room with world leaders who are mostly men. So I'm curious, what feels different about a room of women leaders versus a room of mostly men?
I referred earlier to women leaders generally having less ego involved in the post. I think women come to get a job done. You know? Women are pretty practical. Most women are balancing a lot of things in their life. They're balancing the job, they're balancing the kids, they're balancing the needs of the elder members of the family, other members with particular needs. We're busy people, and so we don't muck around. You know, we just tend to be very, very task focused, less narcissism among women leaders. So I find the ambience between a room of women leaders and a room of predominantly male leaders really quite a stark contrast. And bring on more women leaders. I say, look, in 2000 I went to the Millennium Summit of the UN. And Mary Robinson, who was the UN Human Rights Commissioner and former President of Ireland, convened the women leaders and heads of agencies of the UN who were women. We would have fitted in 2 phone boxes, right? We were so few in number. But, the sad thing is, you look at it now, there's marvellous photos of who was speaking at the UN and Leaders Week this year, personally and virtually. Look, so few women leaders still. So there's a long way to go on this journey. And all I can say is, in my society, it's become the norm to expect that roughly half the time women are going to be leading the country. They've led the country for more than half of the last 23, 24 years. And that would be great to have as the norm and the expectation for every country.
Well, that's something for the rest of us who are not in New Zealand to look forward to. Thank you for balancing us with all your other commitments. Thank you for making the world better for women and girls. And that concludes our time with you and the Her Power Summit. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be sharing the stage today with so many impressive women leaders and change agents. My name is Maggie Lake, and for our next segment, we are delighted to hear from one of those doers and innovators working across sectors to push for tangible impact, not only for women's economic rights and inclusion, but also for larger sustainable development targets. Sanda Ojiambo is the CEO and Executive Director, United Nations Global Compact. Now, she wasn't able to join us live today, so we sat down a couple of days ago to learn more about her work at the UN Global Compact and how she's working to build a culture of principle-based business. Let's hear what she had to say. Sanda, thank you so much for being here. Gender equity is a topic that I know is near to dear to both of us, so it's wonderful to get the chance to talk about it with you today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Maggie. Great to be here.
So how is the UN Global Compact working with the private sector to get them more involved in women's rights and gender equality, to get them involved in that agenda?
Yeah. Maggie, I think it stems from a couple of key positions first. I think first, the fact that inclusive perspectives, inclusive discussions, inclusive results really just bring about inclusive outcomes. And, inclusive outcomes are great for business. They're great for business, they're great for the community, and they're great for the world. I think it's important for business to continuously appreciate that diversity is truly a strength, not a threat. And so, the way that we look at it is the opportunity really exists to expand the spheres of active engagement and meaningful participation for women and girls around the world. And indeed, I think, globally, movements for gender equality are really taking center stage. So at the Global Compact, what we do is working with businesses to see how they can increase that sphere of meaningful participation and meaningful engagement of women and girls in the workplace, certainly in the marketplace, and in the community. And we framed this through a very useful tool that we created with UN Women about 10 years ago, the Women's Empowerment Principles. And there are a set of principles that allow companies to first take an introspective look at what they're doing within their business, and then use the principles and use the tools and guidance to take concrete action around it. You know, when we launched the Empowerment Principles a decade ago, there was about 39 business signatories. Truly proud that today there's over 5,600 business leaders. So business is paying attention. I think the task at hand, Maggie, is really to look at how we take business ambition and truly turn it into business action. I think great progress has been made, but certainly a lot more can be done. And that's what we're really working at and working towards at the Global Compact.
Yeah, it's important to bring that up, Sandra. You feel that the intention is there now. There's so much more conversation about this, but getting those tangible results in is going to be so important. How can the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact be used to encourage companies to advance gender equality? I would think those frameworks are so important.
The frameworks are so important. And to begin with, I think what the 10 principles do is they allow companies to set ambition, to set ambition around key critical issues. When the compact was formed in the year 2000 by the then Secretary General Kofi Annan, he said that he wanted to put a human face to the global market. So it allows companies first to introspect and look at what really is our purpose? Why are we here? What are the principles by which we're going to engage in this business and in this market? And with those principles, then you're able to look at them and then set ambitions. So the 10 principles, yes, are focused on the areas of human rights, on labor, on the environment, and anti-corruption. And they're the foundation which we believe businesses can build a firm, solid base on corporate responsibility and sustainable business practices. And, I think the businesses that do want to be in business for the long term do have to take a principled approach to business. Previously there was a notion that, profits were it. Business was here to do business. But the truth of the matter is that purpose and profit can coexist. And when they coexist, there truly are remarkable outcomes, not just for business, but for the society around it as a whole. And, part of those principles encompass rights. And within rights, we really take a keen look at gender, as we started off discussing, and gender is really fundamental and core, I think, to any business success.
And connecting into that purpose, when I speak to companies and executives now, they really see that as a way to future-proof their company and their business and attract the best talent out there. How have the SDGs played a role in giving companies the opportunity to work on gender equality? I've seen some really interesting developments in this area.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I think the Sustainable Development Goals are a great framework for rallying businesses around important issues. Our principles that I just spoke about were formed and announced in the year 2000. The SDGs came about in 2015 and really focus, government attention, private sector attention, and civil society attention to collaboratively come together in collaboration to address the gender equality agenda. So I think first putting the issue on a global stage makes it important. There's a goal, a goal around gender equality. But, Maggie, if you look at all of the Sustainable Development Goals, they have an element of gender in there. Mm-hmm. There's no way that we can achieve this agenda for humanity, the 2030 agenda, without addressing the gender question. Gender and health is a key issue. Gender and climate is a key issue. Gender and decent work is a key issue. So it really puts a global focus on the issue, but also allows, companies to take practical action towards it.
That is absolutely true. It's intersectional. It crosses over so many areas. And I've been told by many who are looking at this that as you address that issue, it sort of raises all of the boats. You start to make progress on so many different SDGs. Sandra, what needs to be done now? What needs to happen next? How can we harness this momentum that I think we all feel?
Right, Maggie, it's the challenge that we face. It's a challenge between ambition and action. I talked about the 5,600 companies we know that have signed on to the Women's Empowerment Principles. That's simply a drop in the ocean. There's so much more to be done. I think what's really important is for businesses not only to set the ambition, but to recognize that having and addressing gender equality issues is critical for business. it's important to set in place policies and frameworks that work for business, but then it's really important to action them. And that's the question that we get asked the most: how do I do this? And it may seem simple, but it's not always that easy in businesses. And if you look at a business, for example, that is a multinational, they may be able to easily address gender issues at the headquarters, but then you need to look at how the gender equation plays out in your supply chain. How are you including women in your procurement questions? How are you sure that women and girls are not involved in, excessive working hours? How are you sure that you're able to create a family-friendly environment for women, all through your supply chain? So it's really a question for me of setting the ambition, then making the business commitment, putting the policies in place, but just making sure that you can really drive the action, because it's really the transformative action that we need that is going to make that change for women and girls worldwide.
And this is why sharing that knowledge and those lessons is so important. Sanda Ojiambo, Executive Director of the UN Global Compacts, thank you so much for the work that you're doing in this area and for taking the time with us today.
Thank you, Maggie.
During this time when we are all facing a global pandemic, it's still important to elevate the need to work toward better health and medical availability for women. As COVID-19 has exposed and magnified these gender inequalities in health, it's also brought into focus the need to prioritize women's health as a catalyst for social and economic development. Here to discuss how we can best create sustainable change for women's health, please help me welcome Dr. Susan Harvey, Vice President of Global and Medical Affairs at Hologic, Inc., Anita Bhatia, UN Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, and Stephanie Seydoux, Ambassador for Global Health of France. I'm not sure if Stephanie's with us yet or not, but she'll be joining us shortly, hopefully. There she is. Thank you so much for being with us. Welcome to all of you. This is such an important topic to talk about, and I think that actually Anita might be the one who's not joining us, but she will be here shortly. And if you could both unmute yourself. Susan, I'd like to begin with you. Hologic recently completed a huge global survey to capture the state of women's health and healthcare worldwide. I think we all suspect, based on our own anecdotal experiences, that this is an issue. But what did you conclude looking at this on a global scale? What findings jumped out at you?
Oh, it's a great question, and I'm honored to be here today. Thank you, Maggie. What is striking is it's the largest women's health study that's been pushed forward globally. We listen to women, and as a healthcare company, Hologic understands that women are the cornerstone of families, communities, and economies. And as we began to expand globally, we found no organization or method for tracking women's health based on the perspective of women. That's when we partnered with Gallup and leveraged their Whirlpool, which has been in place since 2005. So we asked 60,000 women and girls, aged 15 and older, in 116 countries and over 140 languages, about their healthcare experiences and their opinions of health and safety. As we all know, if we don't measure, we can't manage and we can't improve. And there were two big takeaways from this data. One is, the first is that there are three areas that we need to focus on to improve quality of women's lives and women's health. Detect deadly disease early when we can manage and treat. Keep women safe. 2/3 of the women in the world reported to us that domestic violence is a big problem in the region where they live. And 1/3 of women are not feeling safe walking outside at night alone. And the last is education. Girls and women need to keep their education going as long as possible. It allows them independence for decision making, for income, for healthcare decisions. So we found those three touch points were incredibly important. We also found that there are 5 dimensions of health, just 5 categories in health, that were able to explain 80% of women's life expectancy. So with this information, it allows us to bring awareness by sharing, and countries and regions to plan and strategize how can improvements be made. And we'll be there to measure them.
Yeah, and that's why this is so important. I mean, if you don't have the data, because we're talking about prioritizing, providing resources, if you don't have the data, it's hard to begin to allocate the resources necessary. Stephanie, I'm sure that resonates with you. I mean, this is happening when we have so many other pressures on governments to combat problems. Talk to me a little bit about your perspective and reaction. And when I saw 1 billion women have not seen a doctor in the last, I mean, that is just hard to wrap your head around. What are you seeing on the ground there as you try to wrap your head around women's health, and what is your response to some of the stuff Susan just talked about? Stephanie, you're muted if you want to unmute before you answer.
Thank you. I think, okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for this invitation. I was at the World Health Summit in Berlin a few days ago and was thrilled to also take part in a presentation of the report, which I have to say gave rise to a very intense discussion. And so this is all extremely enlightening, a very enlightening perspective. And as you said, with quite shocking figures, as well as a method, which is a very interesting one to have explained. And I'm sure all of this is possibly perfectible, but it does sort of absolutely succeed in setting a debate, which we had. So I'm not sure this is on this first question the time to reflect on the report itself, but maybe to your question, indeed, the situation today, we suspected is rather unsatisfactory regarding women's health. And we can't remain at a stage where we take stock and not act. And so it's very important that we do have tools such as the Women's Global Health Index to help us set the right questions and move forward. But can I focus on one specific point which became very topical with the COVID-19 pandemic, and which is the role that women have to play the role that women play in the health workforce. Yeah. And I don't know whether that is the right answer to your question.
No, please. That's such an important point, please.
So this is a topic that's been on the table for quite some time. From the year 2016, there was a groundbreaking study by OECD, ILO, and WHO, which indeed focused on the situation of women health worker, or rather women in the health workforce, because a lot of them are unfortunately not paid, and a lot of it is unpaid work, whether in the domestic sphere, or through unpaid work in the form of voluntary work, including in quite a few development programs. And during the pandemic, we've also seen that, well, very luckily in some respects, COVID-19 countermeasures could be taken based on community health work, which was already in place in many countries in the fight against, for instance, malaria or HIV or tuberculosis. Well, still, the pillar was still the same, which was to use such community workers, a majority of which are women, in order to put in place urgent emergency measures against COVID-19. So taking stock of all of this, and based on the fact that 70% of the health workforce are women, France, who was already involved in this study, which I mentioned earlier, decided to take the opportunity of the Generation Equality Forum, which took place in Paris this summer in July, and France was a co-host with Mexico of this Beijing Plus 25 conference, together, of course, with UN Women. And we took the opportunity of the Generation Equality Forum to launch an initiative, or to rather, not launch, it had been launched before, but to enhance an initiative called the Gender Equal Health and Care Workforce Initiative, which promotes the fact that by treating or ensuring that women, or actually healthcare workers, are treated better, we reap three dividends: one on equality, since a great majority of these workers are women; one on quality of health, obviously, with better service provided; and finally, and that was the very interesting argument which this study found, on development, because an investment in health brings investment as of itself in development and in the economy. New jobs created in health will fuel economic growth as well as strengthen the health system, and therefore contribute to the universal health coverage. And
Stephanie, if you don't mind me jumping in, there's so much information. I just want to take a step back and unpack a little of this for our audience. And Anita has joined us now, Anita Bhatia, and I think it's a perfect opportunity for Anita to pick up on that. Stephanie was just saying that development in health, investing in health, is important to overall development. We can't build a better future, Anita, when we are leaving behind so many women and girls. How do we need to think about women's health relative to the Sustainable Development Goals?
No, thanks so much. It's such a great question. And, I was on a panel just before this one. And so sorry, I was a bit late coming in. But that panel was actually on disarmament and military expenditure. And one of the things that I was really struck by in preparing for that panel was the data on military spend during the COVID relative to increases in social investment spend. And so it really goes back to your question on whether or not finance for health spending is a priority. And if you just look at the revealed preference of governments during the COVID pandemic, the fact that military expenditure went up by 2.6% at a time when we were facing a once-in-a-century catastrophe on the health front just tells you about the inertia in government when it comes to changing expenditures and making those difficult trade-off decisions between spend on X and spend on Y. And, we have just come out at the UN and at UN Women with a gender snapshot report, which looks at how are we doing on all of the SDGs, and where, how much of a reflection is there of gender in meeting the SDGs. And actually the only one that is close to target is, and I just digress here for a second to say the proportion of seats held by women in local government. But in all of the other SDGs, they're almost met, but they're nowhere close to target. And so in general, the issue of women and of gender is not prioritized. And then when you take a deeper dive into women's health and you look at the financing associated with that, you have to conclude from the data that notwithstanding all of the things that Stephanie was talking about, this is still not getting enough priority when it comes to resource allocation. And so the way to drive that change is, first of all, to acknowledge that finance is a big part of the solution. Second, to really try to do development financing differently. The old ways aren't going to work. I think thinking about this just as we're going to have to increase the pool of grant money that goes towards this isn't going to work. The old ways of domestic resource mobilization aren't going to work. For a lot of poor countries, financing for health is going to boil down to debt relief for countries who are facing real problems in terms of their overall budget and situation and the fiscal space they have. And where there is fiscal space, what UN Women is pushing is for governments to think about debt financing with a gender lens. So to think about gender bonds that can then be where the use of proceeds can then be allocated to those issues that are specific to gender equality, including women's health. Let me stop there.
Anita, anytime you start talking about sustainable finance, you've got me. But I do, all roads lead back, and I want to return to what Susan brought up. When you can measure it, you can start to manage it or have a conversation around it. And again, there's so many threads. This is it's such an intersectional topic that I think sometimes that can get in the way because a lot of conversations start happening. And then suddenly, you've got by committee, many people brought into conversation, which is important and has to happen. But Susan, if we don't ever wrap our head around what the problem is, we can't begin to find a solution. One of the things that stopped me in my tracks, aside from that gigantic number of women who haven't seen a doctor, we're not talking about emergency care. We're talking about basic screening for basic disease. Right, 1.5 billion women haven't even had their blood. I mean, this creates a situation where I think a lot of people maybe assume this is happening somehow. What is the data telling us in regard to specific measures that need to be taken to improve women's health outcomes?
Thank you, Maggie. It's an important question, and thinking about it from finance and resource, I think there are many opportunities that are low cost and low resource use. So let's go back to those 5 dimensions of health that explain 80% of women's life expectancy. The first one is preventive care, right? So it's identifying deadly diseases early so you can manage them and treat them. Hypertension, you brought this up, high blood pressure. Cardiovascular disease is the biggest killer in the world. And yet when we looked at this, only 1/3 of women in the world had had their blood pressure tested. The skill set and the equipment is minimal to achieve this. So a simple change in having blood pressure testing available so that management can occur. The second biggest killer is cancer. Only 12% of women were tested for any type of cancer as the second biggest killer. Now let's think of that in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. By 2030, the idea is to eradicate cervical cancer. Well, there's a link here with sexually transmitted diseases and cancer. If we're testing for sexually transmitted diseases, we'll have an opportunity to detect HPV, which is linked to cervical cancer. Again, a relatively low source way to move toward the goals and achieving more cancer screening. Diabetes, the fastest growing deadly disease in the world, only 19% of women were tested. And then circling back again to sexually transmitted diseases, obviously HPV is one. There's a vaccine. We have a good chance of hitting this goal if we keep our eye on the ball. HIV is mixed in there too. And we all know what a massive problem HIV is. The other dimensions, emotional health. 2020 had the most negative emotional feelings in over 15 years based on the Gallup World Poll, and a 40% increase. We all understand mind-body relationship, which includes health. We also understand that persistent negative emotions can lead down the road to mental health issues. And then we move to the third, opinions of health and safety. As you've pointed out, Maggie, 2/3 of women in our country tell us domestic violence, in our world tell us domestic violence is a problem. And 1/3 won't walk alone at night. Basic needs is number 4 on this list. 900 million women report to us that they have food insecurity, and 700 million housing insecurity. So again, these are steps that we can take and understand even in low resource places.
Yeah.
Lastly,
Susan, I want to circle back to the security issue. I think it's so important, but I would like to jump over to Stephanie for a moment. And by the way, I'd just like to remind our audience that you can submit your questions in the box on your screen, or also if you're watching online, you can use the hashtag HerPower2021. I want to make sure I got that right. on social media, and we'll bring them back in. Stephanie, the French, you mentioned this before, but I would like to return to this. The French government, along with UN Women, are part of this Gender Equal Health and Care Workforce Initiative. How can groups like this and partnerships like this, especially bringing in people who have experience on the ground, in the field, in many of these countries, how can that help? What kind of progress have you seen?
Thank you very much, Maggie. Well, indeed, this initiative, we launched it also with a very dynamic NGO called Women in Global Health, as well as with the World Health Organization. What we find really interesting since we launched the initiative is that there has been commitment by either governments, and I can talk about that in a minute, which have been putting in place very concrete measures, as well as international aid organizations, for instance, or indeed civil society organizations. And a quick reminder to say that what we indeed are seeking in this initiative is to promote new norms. And going back to Anita Batia's really powerful intervention, well, so the first measure we advocate for is to no longer accept that women are either underpaid or not paid as health workers or care workers. The second norm is to indeed not accept anymore that there isn't enough domestic budget in order for these the right payment or the right conditions to be in place, and to encourage governments to actually allocate a specific part of their budget, well, whether broadly to strengthening health systems. And we remember that there was an Abuja declaration put forward by the African Union in the early 2000s to allocate 15% of their budget to health. But this could also be done through a gender lens or through a gendered budget. The third new norm is to no longer accept that health issues be discussed without women present in the room or decision room, let's say. And finally, to no longer accept that health workers be subjected to violence or harassment, which is still, unfortunately and sadly, broadly the case in many contexts. And for that reason, we encourage governments to sign and ratify the ILO Convention number 190, combating harassment at work. Harassment at work. So these are the engagements, the commitments. And can I just quote two examples of commitments which have been that countries have advocated for? Well, one was from the City of Mexico, which indeed has set aside and raised their budget for health workers in a significant manner, and is tracing this commitment. And the other one was the commitment by an NGO which is active in development called Soltis, based in France, and they are now enforcing procedures whereas they no longer resort to voluntary health work, and they also ensure equal pay, including in all projects that they promote and put in place. So these are two examples. And then we have a few countries which have indeed ratified the ILO convention, which are coming forth, such as, let me turn to my colleague, Fiji. Voilà. Fiji, for instance, is one of the first countries to ratify this ILO convention. France is about to. The process is ongoing, and we're hoping that any day now it will be ratified. But there are still very few countries which are on this path, only about half a dozen. So
work to be done, Stephanie. A work to be done and a call to action. It certainly sounds like, but it is so important to have the early examples of the lessons that with focus, this can be done and it pays dividends. Anita, I think you're so well positioned to talk to this because, we heard that, pick up on Stephanie's point about, you can't say that there's not the domestic budget for it. How do we break the scarcity mindset that surrounds this in terms of competing resources and open the way for countries and governments to see this as something that will help them address some of the other issues and challenges they face, as opposed to taking resources away?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And at the risk of stating the obvious, let me say that I think one of the key things that governments have to do is to recognize that health spending is not a cost, but an investment.
Yes.
And, I really hesitate to say something so basic, but the truth is that many governments still do not see this as an investment that is building human capital, infrastructure, and as a fundamental pillar of growing the economic pie and of creating a more prosperous country, So that is one. The second is, it's not just a question of having more money and more finance. It is the quality of the finance and where is that finance going? So it's the direction of the finance as well. And there, there are good practices in the world around how do you actually create, I wouldn't say optimal, but at least good public expenditure systems which recognize the centrality of investment in health. A third point is that, the world was turned upside down by COVID, and one would think that policymakers recognize that security has many different dimensions today, and that security is not just a question of military spend or closing borders. Security has health is actually a security issue. So I think that is another really important mindset shift where national security conversations need now to have representation from health advocates. I wonder how many national security councils in the world and how many discussions on defense include health advocates and how many include women health advocates. So, it does require more longer term thinking and a different kind of thinking. And then finally, back to the point on the direction of finance. One of the reasons that we're pushing for gender bonds with a couple of countries is because when you commit in any kind of bond issuance to a set of investors, to certain kinds of investment, you're actually not able to change that. And, you get locked into certain things that you cannot go back on. Otherwise, the way budgets work in most countries, you can shift things around. And what we want to do through the direction of finance is to lock certain expenditures in, which cannot then be changed. So it's both a powerful signal to markets about the country's commitment to gender, but it's also a way domestically of tightening and ensuring real accountability for spend on certain priority areas. So these are just some thoughts on how we might, start to reshape the discourse. And final point, just to pick up on this decision-making piece, the fact that the COVID-19 task forces in most countries, by and large, did not have gender parity tells us something, right? You can look at women in decision-making in all aspects of health, but actually just looking at the issue of participation in the COVID task forces and noting that less than 13% of global task forces on COVID had gender parity in the task force. just tells you how far we have to go.
Absolutely. And fantastic points on gender bonds. I will tell you, having a lot of conversations in the sustainable finance sector, that market is enormous, and CFOs who were never asked about ESG before almost are exclusively asked about that. So there's a reframing of the conversation around opportunity that is now coming, and the fact that employees in a very, very competitive fight for human capital and talent are insisting on this, as are customers. So there is a change underfoot in the world of sustainable finance, which we hope that the audience will plug into. Dr. Harvey, a question, and I'm so glad coming from Quentin and Sydney. Surely this 1 billion women having no health checks cannot be US or Europe. Which countries or regions suffer this lack of attention to women? There is an income component to some of it, but interestingly, not all of it. Even developed higher income countries have issues that this index really highlighted.
Absolutely, 100% accurate. What we are seeing is a shift of non-communicable disease into low and middle income countries. We're seeing this happen. Having said that, the developed countries had, or high income, I apologize, high income countries had major problems as well. There are only 17% of the world's population of women living in high income countries. High income countries on the country ranking scored 61. That is
out of 100, right?
Out of 100. And the average was 54. So income didn't get them very far. And so there is not a focus. And we saw that in the United States with COVID. We're seeing that in the United States, where a third of women in the US are pregnant and deliver babies under the age of 19. When that happens, every other health metric is impacted, education is impacted, their entire lives and the lives of their children. So there are many, many challenges. In the US, we think about screening for cancer, having a breast cancer research and clinical background. We would expect about 50% of women in the US to be screened for cancer. And that number is 21%. Like, we are failing even in high income areas. Now, the US is a tricky example, right? We spend much more than anyone else, and our health outcomes are not as good. But similar findings were identified in the EU and the UK. The locations that seem to support women across education and economic demographic factors and determinants of health are Australia and New Zealand, where those countries have been able, through a national health program, to really consistently elevate women's lives. And Costa Rica is another fantastic example where public health and healthcare actually meet. So often that does not help, that does not happen. And a national system is tremendous in promoting that. So I will stop there. But again, only 17% of the women live in high income countries. Yeah. We've got to think about this as we move forward.
And again, even those that do, the results are not there, which brings us back to having gender equity and women in the room in policy discussions and decision making, because that may be shocking to some people, but I think to many of us who have heard the struggles with women in terms of care, in terms of homeschooling, even in the highest income countries, put themselves at the end of the line, have put off basic screenings, basic doctor appointments. And this is not surprising. The magnitude of it is, but the fact that it's happening anecdotally is certainly matches up with much of what I've heard and we struggle with. And I know in my group, we are trying to sort of urge each other to get back on track with that, and put health at the front of our families. You know, exponentially put that into a national lens, and you can imagine what's happening. Stephanie, you've been France's ambassador for global health predating COVID-19 and have worked with some of the communicable diseases that Susan and Anita have been talking about. We have a question coming in. How can partnership with the private sector help governments achieve these health goals and investments? How has your experience, on the front line of trying to grapple with these issues, how has it influenced how you're thinking about this? How important is private-public partnerships in this?
Thank you for the question. Well, it is absolutely crucial. I come from a country which certainly isn't performing perfectly as per the index and as per all the other indicators that we have regarding health, but which has a system which for the longest time from the beginning is one of strong regulation by the public sector, by the state, although a lot of the financing comes not from the state budget, but from social security based on other types of contributions by employers and by workers. It is a system which works with implementation by both a public sector, for instance, public hospitals, as well as private clinics, but all under the same umbrella of regulations with specific, rather complex dialogue between all sectors. So that's the culture in health in France, which is there's public regulation, public policies, but the public sector cannot implement all of this, and the private sector is definitely a partner and an indispensable partner, one without which health could not be brought to the same extent to our citizens. Similarly, the private sector, we've seen it in the crisis, has an agility, has a risk-taking mindset, which makes it the go-to intervener for seeking innovation in health and in other sectors as well. The question we now have, all of us, is indeed how this ability can be brought into a partnership which still guarantees that innovation is accessible to all, that there is equitable access to innovation, without which in health, innovation only brings more inequality rather than the opposite. But so that's been the challenge, for instance, in the COVID response, not the challenge, but the mindset and the way that in the COVID response, the multilateral solidarity mechanism called the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, ACT, has been set up, one in which France has taken a leading role. So maybe to go back to to wrap up on your question, private public partnership is absolutely indispensable to obtain the best results in health. And I guess the bit which is really crucial there is that of the right articulation. To ensure public health outcomes, there has to be a strong public health umbrella, onset policy. There also has to be the right leeway, the right partnership left in order to ensure that the private sector does indeed bring its initiative, its innovation capacity to the fore. And can I go back to the hologenic initiative, and this index is definitely a proof of indeed the benefits that can be brought from this innovative capacity of the private sector in health. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad, Stephanie, that you brought up the innovation. That is such a critical aspect of this. And I think, in the sort of dire situation we face and for all the tragedy surrounding COVID-19, it really illustrated what is possible when everyone comes together and puts innovation at the front, and I think kind of reset expectations. Anita, UN Women has been at the forefront of not only talking about trying to harness the opportunity, but also illustrating the toll that COVID-19 has taken on women. 40 billion has been raised through the Generation Equality campaign. As we talk about all of the challenges and the need and the need to focus and invest, how would you like to see that money spent by governments and civil society? Where can the biggest impact come from?
Thanks for that great question. But before I answer it, can I just share the data on the gender makeup of COVID task forces, because my team reminded me
Yes, please.
So I think this is shocking, okay? Of the total 225 COVID-19 task forces across 137 countries, women made up 24% of the members only. And of those task forces where we have sex disaggregated data, only 4%, 4.4% have gender parity. So, I think this is, it's even lower than I thought it was. And so I think I want to put those facts out there, and I hope people will share them and quote them, because I think we need to keep coming back to this issue of women having a seat at the table. Now to your question on the 40 billion. So let's look at the breakdown of that 40 billion. 10 billion of that is from the World Bank for spend, particularly in Africa. 10 billion of that is from one private sector company, which is committing to doing more on gender in its supply chain. And the remaining 20 billion is from different commitments from different civil society partners, private sector partners, and others. And so the way we would like this money to be directed is, we have 6 action coalitions as part of Generation Equality, and these cover the gamut of issues on gender equality, whether it's women's participation and decision-making and political participation, bodily autonomy and sexual and reproductive health, women in technology, innovation, the STEM fields, so we cover a range of issues, and we'd like to see the spend directed to the issues within these action coalitions, which have been identified as the key levers for change and for really bringing about transformative impact. But I do want to say one other thing, and that's on the role of the private sector. And I fully agree that there is a really important role on innovation. But I think we also have to acknowledge that sometimes there is a mismatch between the short-term profit maximization goal of the private sector and the longer-term goals of investment in health systems. Mm-hmm. And so I do think we need smarter regulation in a number of countries, because the private health systems, whether they are for-profit or not-for-profit, are not necessarily always aligned with a country's goals in terms of achieving good health outcomes for all. And I think there does need to be, and actually COVID was the great revealer. COVID was the great revealer on this. And when, I look at what is happening today on vaccine access, and the fact that the world is divided into those who have the vaccine and those who don't, and the role that the private sector plays in that, I have to say we need more smarter, better regulation.
We do need regulation.
And better global governance.
And this is why it has to be a private-public partnership, not just a private, quest for a solution. You need them all with the gender balance, with the gender equity in there, if you are going to have a response that doesn't leave any group behind. Susan, we have a question that's very interesting. What is the 5th dimension of women's health? And also, can you share where everyone can find this is coming in from DC, or you are in DC. Can you share the website where everyone can find the nitty-gritty on all of this information from the index and survey?
Yes, absolutely. The index can be shared. It was released at the time of the UN General Assembly in New York by our CEO, Steve McMillan. The 5th dimension, so just briefly, preventive care, emotional health, opinions of health and safety, basic needs, and the 5th dimension is individual health. And what that is getting at is how many women live in pain? How many women have chronic disease that cause them disability in their daily lives? And we absolutely have this data available, and I will send the link, Maggie, wherever I'm told, so that people can access it.
and we will be sure to tweet it out and put it on social media with the link to this. So no worries about that. I'm going to say a very quick goodbye to Anita Bhatia from UN Women, who is got to run off to another engagement, which we want to make sure she gets to.
Thank
so she
you.
Can continue to spread the good word. Anita, thank you so much for being with us. And we only have a couple of minutes left, but Sarah, I wanted to ask you, you know, we have a very high profile COP26 coming up, and we have a viewer asking what commitments from Harvard in the US, what commitments are needed at COP26 to address the impact of climate change on health, including increasing respiratory illness, diabetes, and cancer? I continue to come back to this issue that this is so intersectional. The issue of women's health crosses over so many other topics. Governments really have to look at it in a very holistic way, don't they? Stephanie, you're muted. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Well, absolutely. I mean, this is the next. Well, I mean, the multilateral agenda is a very busy, intense, and accelerated one. But this is definitely, we're not even out of COVID with all the challenges that have been that we were reminded of during this panel. And but meanwhile, the climate situation is still getting worse and still in need of the same level of attention and commitment. So it is absolutely crucial that governments are indeed paying the right kind of attention. We're going to have to change the way we live, the way we think of the future. This is an impact which will need to be taken at the most at the highest political level in all governments in order to ensure that transition is actually taking place. And it is also something which will need to impact the way we conduct our daily lives. So maybe, I mean, this is a personal thought, but since we have seen how our lives can actually be impacted by this crisis, in all countries, everything was brought down. I mean, in some cases, it was confinements, lockdowns, curfews. In very unfortunately, a majority of cases, acute health difficulties, losing one's livelihood, access to nutrition, food, etc. So these are the dire consequences that we face when we do not pay enough attention to a global challenge. But there were also some positive outcomes, and in some ways we were able to take up maybe new habits in the sphere of those who do go to an office every day. Well, actually the development of telework was definitely an improvement, one which doesn't have only benefits, but which does have benefits when applied in right conditions. And everyone in the public-private work spheres right now is thinking about how to retain the benefits and not the without going into other problems. So we have experienced what it's like to actually change our ways, not by choice, and in very many cases with not favorable consequences. So this makes the stake of actually changing the way we look at the future and the way we lead our daily lives a possibility. So I really, really hope that this will help our leaders make the right decisions during the COP26. And France is definitely coming forward with pursuing its strong commitment, the one which we have had since the COP21 in Paris. May I just end on one note, which is to say that there is a very important dimension which links all these global health stakes, and that is the One Health dimension, which is to say that health cannot be only thought in terms of human health. Animal health, agriculture, the environment, and human health are all linked together. And it is about time that leaders take up this way of thinking at the most global level. So France advocated for the creation of a high panel of experts, which will, a little bit like the GIEC on climate, come up with analysis and suggestions for public opinion in general and for global leaders to take up in order to ensure that indeed by respecting the environment and by preserving nature and avoiding harmful practices, we do indeed ensure that in the future we avoid some of the conditions which brought about this pandemic. And this One Health dimension, I think, is something which I hope COP26 will also help promote.
Absolutely. Fantastic point to make. Susan, I'd like to conclude with some final thoughts from you. As a health professional, as someone who's looked at these issues for so long, what is your call to action? What does the index offer to policymakers and health leaders with regard to choices they can make when it comes to social welfare and health system reforms?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. There's a lot of data, and that analysis can be pared down country by country. So certainly there's more in-depth data that can be provided country to country. We understand now what the current state of women's health and safety is, and we are committed to continuing that measurement for management. So countries need to look at their priorities, understand what resources they have, and how they can apply them to making changes. And just as an example, basic needs, food and shelter, blood pressure, just checking blood pressure. So there are small shifts that can be made in all countries. And then the measurement of how that progress has changed women's health and quality of life. And so we really believe that this is a roadmap, and we will continue to measure as steps along that road to improving health are made, and demonstrate what is most effective, what is most efficient, and how we can do this with potentially limited resources to impact the highest number of women around the world.
And we certainly hope that leaders will take what is an opportunity to make that change. Dr. Susan Harvey, Vice President of Global Medical Affairs at Hologic, thank you so much for being with us today. Anita Bhatia, who had to leave already, UN Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, and of course, Stephanie Sado, Ambassador for Global Health of France. Thank you so much for all of your insight. We appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Now, coming up next, I am happy to introduce Dr. Sanjeev Kagram, Dean of the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University, who discussed the importance of girls' education and entrepreneurial spirit in advancing gender equality. Dr. Sanjeev was virtually joined by Ranjina Hamidi, former Afghanistan education minister, for this timely discussion. Let's watch the conversation.
Welcome, everyone. Minister Ranjina, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation about some very challenging and transformative issues that are facing you and me and all of us on this planet of ours. We want to start off, Minister Ranjina, very personal, with you sharing a little about your personal story, about your parents, who I know mean so much to you, how you ended up in the United States in the first place, and a little bit about your early childhood and growing up here in the United States prior to returning to Afghanistan. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is really an honor to speak with you. And you hit the spot again, Dr. Kagram, by asking me the personal question. I've become a refugee most recently, the second time in my life, about 45 years. The first time we became refugees was in the early 1980s. In fact, in 1981, when my parents were forced to flee the country due to the Soviet invasion. And at that time, I was about 5. We ended up in Pakistan, neighboring country. And we lived in Pakistan for about close to 7 years. But my father made the ultimate decision to come and become a refugee to the United States because his little girls, myself and my little sister, we were not allowed to go to school. There was no regime in Pakistan controlling us, but it was our own predecessors of the today's Taliban who luckily warned us not to go to school. So we ended up in the United States in 1988, and I lived my refugee life as a typical typical refugee would in America, going to school, finishing high school with honors. So I was a proud daughter of my parents, and then ended up going to the university, only to find myself back in Afghanistan in 2003, where I began my career as an adult, wanting to help the country that gave me birth.
Well, as a fellow refugee, as you know, my story and my family, we were expelled by Idi Amin from Uganda in the 1970s, and then ended up in refugee camps in Italy, and then were sponsored by a wonderful family from a Unitarian church to the great state of New Jersey, where we started again, very, very much like you. Went through school, ended up getting a full ride scholarship to Stanford. And yet, I know a lot of Americans still don't fully understand the psyche of a refugee, what it means to us to be welcomed to a wonderful new homeland that welcomes us, like the United States, with wonderful people that support us through our lives, of course, our parents and our families, but also many others. And yet to have this deep attachment also to our mother and fatherlands. Could you share a little bit about, that part of being a refugee, because it's so important, I think, for our audience to understand it?
I think it's a great point you raise, and I'll share my personal story. Growing up in America, there was this notion of you have to be titled in America, who you are. And so the title we were given was Afghan American. And I never really quite felt comfortable with that growing up in the US, particularly when I attended university from 1996 until 2000. I always argued with friends and family whenever they hyphenated me. I said, no, I'm either an Afghan or an American. And in growing up in Virginia, I always knew that I was Afghan. And the reason for that, even though we had emigrated, but it was not my choice, it was the choice of my parents. The reason I kept calling myself Afghan was I spoke the languages, I practiced the religion that was handed down to me, we ate food, we dressed at home like Afghans, and then we were living a dual life of being an American also outside of home. But I realized in 2003, when I returned to Afghanistan for the first time as an adult, it took me less than 2 months to realize that, in fact, I was an Afghan American. And that's what happens to refugees. You try to struggle with your identities, multiple identities that you begin to create. And so while I became comfortable with my identity as an Afghan American, 2 months after living abroad back in my birth country of Afghanistan, I slowly started to fall in love back with my mother's land, in spite of all the troubles that it carried itself and that it had on the ground with it. But I ended up devoting the next 18 years of my life to a country that gave me birth, but that I had no childhood memories of. And so serving Afghanistan, particularly with the presence of the American troops, with the high interest of American government, and then having this dual identity that I became comfortable with, actually became a tool and a strategic tool for me to navigate both cultures and both societies. And that is absolutely, you pin it right on the spot, that it's hard to make others understand who don't go through that experience of dual identities. So while it can both be a privilege, it ends up being a curse too sometimes in life, as we've seen most recently.
So 9/11 happens. You're in the United States. It seems like yesterday, but it's now been 20 years. What was the feelings you had? How did you react when those events, those tragic events, which really are punctuation in a much longer history, but yet here we were, many of us, and certainly the two of us in the United States. How did it hit you?
I'll explain the whole thing with one phone call that I received from my immediate director. I was working as a program assistant at a small NGO based in Fairfax, Virginia. Mark called me that evening around 8 p.m. And he said, if you don't want to come to work tomorrow, Liz, our CEO, has authorized you to stay at home. And I didn't question him as he said that, because I was planning on not going to work the next day anyway. You could not work and be productive after what had happened. And I'm sure this was not the case just for me, but for all the population in America at that time. But when I hung the phone down, I thought to myself, and my dad was again sitting in the same room where I was talking, I said, why did he call me? So I called him back up and I said, Mark, is this privilege given to the whole staff, or are you just particularly giving me this privilege? And he said, well, I want you to know that you're Muslim, and I had two other Muslim colleagues who were men. And I said, and he said that Liz has authorized the three of you to stay home because the situation is not good, and your safety is important to us. So while I thanked him and I appreciated him and Liz, and I understood that they meant well, the next morning, just like every other morning, I got up, I got ready, got in my car, went to work. And when Liz came to the office, she usually would take her route to her office was right in front of my office. She passed it, turned back around, and at the door, she said, did Mark call you last night? I said, yes, he did. And he's like, so, but you're here. I said, Liz, I had nothing to do with 9/11. Just because I happen to share a faith with people who did this terrorist act does not mean that I'm responsible for the act of a few terrorists. I don't appreciate being lumped into this terrorist group, which is a handful of people, and they are not religious in my opinion at all, and I don't consider them Muslims. So that she came and hugged me and encouraged me and was proud of me. I think that was my first kind of one of the first acts or actions that I took in my life to stand out and to stand for what I believe in. And ever since then, you know, I've not forced myself, but I see myself as the force to speak and act against things that seem unjust to me. And September 11th and those experiences then led to, within 2 days, we knew that Afghanistan, actually even that same very evening, even though many journalists and news channels couldn't make the link together, but my father was always involved in listening to Afghan politics. And Ahmad Shah Massoud was killed 2 days before September 11th. He was killed on September 9th. So while Dad and I sat over dinner and talked about politics, we made the link saying, this is no accident that Ahmad Shah Massoud gets killed 2 days before September 11th happens, 9/11. Who knows what the immediate future for Afghanistan held that night. So for me, September 11th carried that personal connection or personal story, but it also immediately linked it to something was going to Afghanistan, my birth country.
Then take us forward. You decided to move to Kabul, shift into different parts of civil society, then eventually education. Walk us through relatively quickly, because we're going to be running out of time pretty soon, that shift, Minister Rangina.
My daughter, I have one beautiful daughter, and she got closer and closer to age 7, and I was still in Kandahar. And I asked myself, I said, I'm a feminist woman living in Afghanistan with a daughter who I hope to also train to become a strong feminist. I said, how can I jeopardize her future, her educational future, by keeping her here? So her future, or the fear for her future, pushed me to take a bold move to move to Kabul, because there was a better school option. And there my friend and I started the first international school in Kabul by the name of Mizan International School, and my daughter was the first student there. And then the work of almost close to 4 years of work in Mizan International School led me to accept the position of becoming a first female Minister of Education after 30 years under President Ghani's administration. It was a hard decision to make, but it was a necessary decision at the time. And so I served the Ministry of Education as minister from June 2020 until August 15, 2021.
And if you could overview, what were some of the major initiatives you were trying to undertake as minister? And it's one of the only, I understand it, female ministers at the time, not only the first one in education after 30 years.
I think we can
know it's
spend
hard.
hours, but I'll try to wrap it up quickly. First, it was not easy. I thought, my journey as a businesswoman, as someone who was working with civil society and the NGO world, and then a private school, which is also a business, I thought that joining the ministry would be an extension of those activities. But boy, was I wrong, because as one of a very prominent and a high official in the government told me, he said, Minister Hamidi, you're the perfect candidate for this position, but you have come to a very political seat with having no political affiliation. I think that summed up my position in the ministry. But nevertheless, I had made a decision, and I was going to bring about the change that I had promised my president and myself that I was going to do. So we started on a very, very aggressive reform agenda, and the first of which included restructuring the ministry to make it efficient and to make it effective, because we had over 5,000 people staff in Kabul alone to manage a ministry that was just so big and so disorganized. And there was a lot of corruption at many levels. And so my immediate reform agenda included getting rid of some of these very apparent corrupt leaders, which was not very well received, of course. Then it followed up with writing the first national education policy, which the final draft is actually even still with me. We were going to announce it in September. And then it also began with our huge focus on revising the curriculum, because the curriculum of the past 20 years was not made for Afghanistan. It was not intended to raise children that would be Afghans or love Afghanistan. And in our reform agenda, the whole process of revising the curriculum was to educate children to become future leaders of a country that they would call their own and not run away from it, seeing it as a foreign nation.
And I know, in addition to those incredible pieces and many others, the empowerment and education of girls and young women were a big part of that. So this was all moving forward, and then everything changed all of a sudden. So can you share a little bit about the incredible, sad, but real aspect of your second refugee experience now, leaving Afghanistan most recently?
Absolutely. Many people questioned my intentions as a woman leading an institution that was predominantly seen as a man's institution, although the Ministry of Education was the largest employer of women civil servants in the country. Over 33% of our teachers out of the 220,000 across the country were women. And so that's an incredible data to work with. But particularly with girls' education, I could see it in my visits. I could see it in the interactions that I was carrying with my female colleagues, as well as the female students, going and visiting schools. Little girls would come and hug me, and I would kiss them because my gender allowed me to do that, take pictures with me. And then I would see young teenage girls saying, we want to be a minister too. I'm sure that they probably could not say that to a male minister in the past 20 years or 19 years prior to me. So I could actually see that just having a female presence at such a leadership position was enough to encourage girls to look up to that. And I would always say, get educated, get your education done to the highest level that you can, so that you can become not only the Minister of Education, but ultimately the President of Afghanistan, because there's no law that could stop you or prevent you. Little did I know that the international community was unfortunately working behind our backs, thousands of miles away from our country, to make a deal with a regime that would come back and stop girls from going to school, stop women from attending their workforce in majority of the sectors. And now the world is, that decision, unfortunately, on August 15th, I was surprised and shocked, like millions of people, to actually witness and see our country basically very very easily handed over to a group that is internationally known as a terrorist group. But at the same time, I'm very cynical too, and very critical of the people who made this decision, which was not the Afghan government, which was not important elements within the country. Of course, opposition leaders helped bring this situation upon the Afghan government, and the international community unfortunately supported it. So I ended up losing my home, my country, my ministry, my love for the millions of children. I was given a title of Mother of Education in the short period that I served. And I lost my motherhood to education internally, but having the great opportunity to be at Thunderbird School of Management and working with you, Dean Khagram, and your colleagues and our colleagues, I'm privileged enough to say that I'll continue to fight for education, because even though I still recognize and realize that women's economic empowerment is a great, great tool to use in places, particularly like Afghanistan, but I think we can enhance that further with education opportunities. And what more beautiful initiative than to start education at its roots when children are young and their minds are so willing to absorb so much so quickly. So if we begin early, we can achieve a lot more later in life, rather than trying to fix adults' lives that have had to miss the opportunity of education early on. So whatever I can from abroad, I'll continue to fight and continue to make the world aware that my girls, my millions of little girls in Afghanistan, not only deserve, it is their right to be educated. And I'm counting on them and their leadership in the future, because unfortunately, many of my men leaders in Afghanistan have not done a great job in the past 40 years to show a different path towards the future of Afghanistan.
Well, you're an inspiration to all of them and to all of us. We are so honored that you joined us again at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. It's bittersweet, because we'd rather have you back home doing the incredible work that you did. We know that Senator Duckworth will now be addressing this wonderful audience as well, and share her views on what happened in Afghanistan and where we're headed in the future. But we know that you will continue to be a leader for women all over the world, and certainly back in your homeland. Thank you for all that you do and all your leadership.
Thank you. And I look forward to coming back, or going back to my home one day, but still continuing to work with you guys.
It's our honor.
Thank you.
That was Ranjina Hamidi, former Afghanistan Education Minister, and Dr. Sanjeev Kagram, who is Dean at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. That was a fascinating and important conversation. And now I'm excited to lead us into our next session. I'd like to welcome Senator Tammy Duckworth. Senator Duckworth is an Iraq War veteran, Purple Heart recipient, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and currently serving on many committees in the Senate, including the Senate Democrats Special Committee on the Climate Crisis and the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, among others. And prior to her time as a senator, she served in the U.S. House of Representatives, where she was an advocate for working families and job creation. And I have to say, on a personal level, I'm really thrilled to speak with Senator Duckworth, because she has improved my life through her actions as a senator, both in her bipartisan Friendly Airports for Mothers Act, which ensures new mothers have access to safe, clean, and accessible lactation rooms when traveling through airports, which is something I really appreciate. And she's also worked to strengthen parental leave and access to childcare for military families, which again, I have firsthand testimony of how she's improved lives through. So thank you so much for joining us and for your work in those areas, Senator.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
I wanted to start with legislation you introduced for a nonpartisan Afghanistan War Commission. And I wanted to ask what your goals are for that commission, and also how you see the connection between women's issues and protection of women's rights in Afghanistan with broader national security concerns.
So my legislation would establish a commission to look at the span of the 20 years of the United States involvement in Afghanistan, but then also look at the breadth of government, like everybody that was there, from administrations in the White House, to all of the different Congresses, to each of the different departments, because we need to learn what we did wrong, that after 20 years and trillions of dollars of taxpayer money, within a week of us pulling out of Afghanistan, the country collapsed. What happened? And my guess, what I think based on the work that I've done is that we did not truly do any nation building. We put the military in there, and we tasked the military with doing a job that it's supposed to do, which is defeat and those who came after the United States on 9/11 and fine and hold Osama bin Laden accountable, which they did. But then I think we sort of looked away and never went on to the next mission, which should have been not under the purview of the DoD, but should have been under the purview of the State Department. And this is where women and girls comes into play. The military's job and expertise is not in nation building. It's not in teaching and helping to establish a judiciary, a system of law and order, So they never did any of that. And I just remember going to Afghanistan in 2014 doing an all-women Congresswomen's trip. And we were able to kick the male translators out of the room when we sat down with women, Afghan women police officers, trainees, and Afghan women national security trainees. And they spoke beautiful English. And we sat down, which we suspected that they were being sort of watched over by the Afghan government. We were not able to speak. So because we were all women, we were able to kick all of the men out of the room. And what they said to us was, thanks for training us, but we'll never get to do our jobs. Me as a police officer, I will never get to go out into the provinces and help Afghani women and girls who are the victims of crime, because guess what? None of those police stations have a female bathroom or a female entrance to the police station. So the women can't come to us for justice. We'll never be able to do our jobs. You trained us, but we'll never be able to do our jobs. So we came home in 2015, passed legislation in a bipartisan way, and put $20 million into an account for the Afghan government to specifically build both housing and bathroom facilities for the Afghan women security officers and the Afghan women police officers so they could do their jobs. It was never touched, never touched. In 20 years, $20 million, they never touched it. And so this is the kind of thing I want to see. Why was it that the institutions that should have been built up over those 20 years were really hollow institutions, so that immediately you saw women and girls being kicked out of universities from not being able to do their jobs, all of those things, when the institutions of the nation should have been much stronger. And part of it is because we didn't put enough money into those programs. We didn't emphasize those programs. We just kept our eyes only on the military mission. And once the military left, you saw what happened.
You mentioned that the Afghan police officers didn't have access to bathrooms, and that's something that's a tangible difference that was needed in order for them to be able to do their jobs. You were the first in so many respects, the first Thai woman to be elected to the US Congress, the first person to give birth while serving in office as a US Senator, the first female senator to use a wheelchair permanently. Obviously, no one sets out to be the first, but I bet you faced a lot of practical and logistical difficulties along the way. Can you talk a little bit about some of those and how you've tried to make the way easier for the women and people coming after you?
Yeah, I think, I was always just trying to do my job. And one of the reasons I fell in love with the Army, with the US Army, was it was very much a meritocracy. So when I showed up and I was a cadet and I was trying to decide what job I wanted to do, I thought I was going to become a linguist, a translator, because I speak a couple of Asian languages. But I took an aptitude test for helicopter pilots and scored off the charts. And the military said, nope, you're not going to become a translator. You're going to become a helicopter pilot because you scored, you took the test. And because that test was open to me and I could take it, I was able to demonstrate in, in a completely neutral way that I was a better candidate to be a pilot. And that was really, for me, the first step. And then, I've always been the only woman in an all-male unit or one of just a handful of women. And all along the way, I was just trying to do my job. But that involved me having to get the rules changed. And so what I try to do now is make sure I mentor younger women to pursue the careers that they want to pursue, but also mentor young men as well, because young men need to see that women can be leaders, that women can be strong, that women are people they need to respect and try to emulate. It's not, we shouldn't just be reaching out and mentoring young women, very important. I remember that same trip to Afghanistan, I talked to a bunch of university students, and the young men in that university class said, hey, I've had women in class with me now for, since I was in the equivalent of the 6th grade, and now we're in university, and the women in all my classes, a lot of them are a lot smarter than me and get better grades. So they saw the capabilities of women, which was contrary to a lot of the arguments made to subjugate women. And so I think what I've tried to do along the way was just get access, but also mentor those coming behind me, that you gotta, everybody gets a shot, and then you do your best and carry your own weight, and that makes the nation better.
And not just when you said access, that also implies that you've got to sometimes change the rules, as you said yourself. So when you were the first person to give birth as a US Senator, tell me a little bit about how you had to have some rules changed.
Well, when I was pregnant with my second child, as soon as I got pregnant, I knew I was going to change the rules, because the United States Senate requires senators to vote in person. We don't have electronic voting. You have to physically go into the room to vote, thumbs up or thumbs down on each piece of legislation. But the only ways to access that room are stairs. And there's one way in and out that is wheelchair accessible. And the rule in the US Senate was that no children are allowed on the floor of the United States Senate. It's different in the House. When Speaker Pelosi was Speaker back in 2006, she actually changed the rules back then when she became Speaker, and she has allowed children onto the floor of the House since 2006. If you're 12 and under, can go on the floor. But the Senate is very old-fashioned, so they said no. So I had to mount a 9-month-long campaign to convince the other senators to agree to let me bring my baby onto the floor, because I still have to do my job, and I can't do my job remotely.
Tell me what your opening line is to Mitch McConnell when you're trying to get this rule changed.
Well, the opening line was, I'm pregnant and I need to get the rules changed. And then we had to talk to the chairman of the Rules Committee, which was Orrin Hatch, and he said, oh. But the most insane thing with the questions they asked about what would, they asked what is the dress code for the baby going to be? This is ridiculous. Why do you care what the dress code for the baby? The Senate is very much tradition bound. You have to wear a blazer, you have to wear shoes, no hats. I'm like, well, she's a baby. She'll wear a beanie. I'm not taking that off her head. She's in footy pajamas. Would that count as shoes? I did put her in a blazer when I brought her on the floor. And then, so there was all of this, these questions that really was trying to get to the main question. And finally, it was one of the Republican women. She came up to me and she said, Tammy, really, all of this is just about, the guys want to know if you're going to breastfeed on the floor.
And what's the answer?
I said, if she's hungry, yeah.
And did you breastfeed her on the floor?
I ended up never breastfeeding her on the floor because she was always asleep.
Oh, that's good. What a good baby.
Yeah. So I was just like, if I have to, I will. She needs to be fed. If I have to breastfeed, I'm going to breastfeed. It's not like I want to do this in front of you. And it's like, and by the way, what's wrong with that?
But Orrin Hatch didn't use the word breastfeeding. It was just clear that he was trying to get to that.
He was trying to get to that. He couldn't say it, but finally a female Republican came over. But Roy Blunt, when Orrin Hatch retired, Roy Blunt, when he became the chairman of the Rules Committee, because the Republicans were in charge, said to me, Tammy, as soon as I am in charge of the committee after Orrin retires, I'm going to take care of this. And he did. And so 3 days after my baby was born, he changed the rules for me. And it was a unanimous vote. 100% of the senators supported it, and the rules would change. So it was very bipartisan in how it happened, but it was very generational in the opposition to it.
Interesting. I'm so curious about your experiences in the Army versus your experiences in Congress. I looked up the percentages ahead of time. The Congress, 27% of members are women. Active duty U.S. Army is 14% women. But you mentioned that the Army was kind of a meritocracy. So tell me a bit about which is easier? Which is easier as a woman?
I think the Army is easier as a woman because you can truly now. I was in a branch of the Army that's very technical, right? I was a helicopter pilot. So it's a little bit different than maybe some of the other jobs. But I really feel like in the Army, it was very clear what the mission was, and you just had to accomplish the mission. And there are these metrics you have to meet all the time. In the Senate, it's a little bit, the only metric you have to meet really is your voters. Will your voters vote for you and re-elect you? And so there's a lot of relationship building and all of that, whereas I'm just used to it in the Army. I go fly my mission. Did I fly the mission successfully and kill the enemy? Did I successfully deliver, the equipment on time in my helicopters? Are my helicopters all mission ready? Or any, do I have a readiness rate where not too many of my helicopters are working down? So my metrics were very clear. One thing about both the military and being elected is that I do get equal pay for equal work, which is something I've enjoyed my entire career, which most civilian women do not enjoy. Most civilian women make, as on average, 70 cents on the dollar that a man makes. And a lot of military women, when they leave the military and they go into the civilian workforce, actually see a drop in their income relative to their male counterparts. And that's why you see many more of a higher percentage of homeless veterans are actually women, and women who are heads of households.
I hadn't thought about that. The public service transparency and salaries is actually really good for women in that regard.
It is.
Okay, final question for you, though I could talk forever, is you mentioned that when you were in Afghanistan, you got together with some Afghan women leaders and you pushed the male translators out of the room. Tell me how a room of women leaders feels different to, say, gathering on the floor of the US Congress.
I think it was very collaborative, and I think we were able to be much more, in a way, blunt with each other. We cut to the chase. I will tell you that studies have shown that even in the US Congress, the women senators actually have a much higher rate of pieces of legislation that are passed, and our legislation tends to be much more bipartisan. So the productivity of women senators, on average, studies have shown, is actually higher than male senators. And I sort of feel like that was the same way when I was sitting down with Afghan women leaders, just because for you to be a female leader in Afghanistan, you have to know how to get stuff done in the light of significant obstacles and opposition. And so it was actually, in a way, very refreshing to be in a room with women who just, when it was just all us, they didn't beat around the bush. They just talked, this is what needs to be done. These are the problems. These are our fears. This is what you need to do to help us.
Well, thank you so much. If anyone knows how to get stuff done, it's you, Senator Duckworth. Thank you for your time today. Closing Her Power 2021. Now I welcome back Rena Ninan. Rena, take us into the final session of today's summit.
Amelia, thank you so much. So great to hear from Senator Duckworth. And we want to thank everyone out there watching as well, for all of you engaging on Twitter. Remember, you can engage our panelists in all these issues and foreign policy with the hashtag HerPower2021. I'm excited about this next conversation about sustainability and smart ideas, looking at industries, particularly in the field of sustainability. What can make a difference? What are the ideas? And for this conversation, I'm joined by two experts. We're looking at sustainability to renewal, regenerative solutions to the climate crisis. And I'm joined by Brianne West, who's the founder of Rethinking, an eco-conscious beauty company. And I'm joined by really a legend, I think it's fair to call her that, Dr. Sylvia Earle, who is also the founder of Mission Blue, which promotes ocean conservation. Hard to get that word out, Dr. Earle. I want to talk to you because the New Yorker calls you her deepness. The New York Library of Congress refers to you as a living legend. And Time Magazine voted you the first hero of the planet. And all of these are really worthy mentions. How did you get into studying oceans and become so passionate about it?
My question is, why doesn't everyone dive in?
Great question.
Well, as a child, a wave knocked me over and the ocean got my attention. But what has held my attention ever since is the fact that the ocean is alive. It looks like from the surface to be water, rocks and water. But once you dive in, put your face underwater in the ocean, you can see that it's just like a minestrone, except everything, all those little pieces are living creatures. And knowing that leads to the bigger issue that Earth, our planet, our home planet, is a biogeochemical miracle mostly bio. Think about life that shapes our home planet in ways that make it hospitable for us. We have air that comes from the photosynthesizers have taken rocks and water and provided an atmosphere that is friendly to us. It's a living planet that makes Earth possible, makes our lives possible.
How do you think studying oceans has changed over the course of your career, and what really motivates you, Dr. Earle?
Well, since I began exploring the ocean in the 1950s, using scuba, then little submarines, living underwater 10 times, and looking at what has been learned, we've learned more about the nature of the ocean, how the ocean and climate are totally connected, how most of life on Earth is in the sea, that 97% of Earth's water is ocean. All life requires water, ours very much included. And to understand at the same time that we have learned more about the ocean than during all preceding history, we have literally lost more. So half the coral reefs are now gone. Mangroves, seagrass meadows, sharks, 90%, tunas, again. I've been a witness to the greatest era of learning, at the same time, the greatest era of loss. But the good news is, now we know. We know now that our very existence depends on maintaining the planet, the planetary systems. The ocean is the cornerstone of what makes our existence possible. If we didn't know, we would be even more of a problem, a dilemma, if we than we know. We know we've got problems. And in the next 10 years, we have the best opportunity we'll ever have to shift from decline to recovery. And I'm really optimistic that we can do this, that we will do this.
Shifting from decline to recovery. Dr. Earle, you talked about water. I want to turn now to talk to Brianne. Brianne, who is a remarkable environmentalist and social entrepreneur. Brianne, I have something really embarrassing, very embarrassing to show you because you're on the front of change. This is from my shower. Okay, I pulled this from my shower today. We have a global audience here at Foreign Policy. I am so embarrassed and humiliated to be holding this up to show you guys. This is all of the products in my bathroom that I use in the shower. And your company is looking to change that. Actually, I should say has changed that. Brianne, tell me a little bit about your journey and what you managed to do when you found out how much water and plastic was in some of these products.
It's very simple, really. It seemed 9 years ago, it seems absolutely crazy to me that we make products that are 75 to 90% water, package them in plastic, ship them around the world, and of course, being mostly water, that's very heavy and therefore has a very high level of carbon emissions, and then we use them in a room full of water. What sense does that make? Of course, water makes up these products from a economic standpoint. It makes them much cheaper. So I created a tech to stop that madness effectively and concentrate the active ingredients. But beyond the product itself, I also wanted to prove that it was absolutely possible for a company to operate as ethically and as regeneratively as possible, to give back far more than we ever take, to treat people with respect throughout the supply chain, and to ensure that nobody is put back or disincentivized or in any way disadvantaged by working with us.
And
you're really the take in a nutshell.
Yep. And you are, Brianne, really the first plastic-free, full cosmetic and personal care line. Looking into your company, it's really, you've managed to eliminate water and plastic, as you said, but you've created these concentrated bars that are actually packaged in compostable waste and cardboard. For many people, being sort of environmentally forward and creating a climate neutral company, it's trendy, it's hard to do, it's not easy. How do you get other companies to move towards long sustainability practices?
They won't do it unless you force them. not strictly true, actually. There's plenty of entrepreneurs and smaller businesses out there who are really doing the hard yards. But to turn those big ships, the big CPG companies, the Unilevers, the P&Gs, consumer power needs to come in, and you're already seeing it happen. They are implementing sustainability initiatives hand over fist. And previously, they've been a little bit greenwashy, let's be honest, and these pledges have lacked ambition and lacked follow through. But now you're beginning to see that these companies are understanding that this is the way they will attract and retain customers for life. So they need to do this. So the best way to encourage businesses to change is to show them that it's possible through other businesses doing so, and consumers to demand more of their favorite brands. And you're seeing it, and it will only continue to grow.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Dr. Earle, you've got a new book coming out next month in November. It's National Geographic Ocean, A Global Odyssey. What do you hope people take away from that book?
I hope they understand the importance of the ocean and life in the ocean. The last part of the book really deals with how the ocean affects everyone, everywhere, all the time. With every breath we take, every drop of water we drink, we are connected. Even if you never see or touch the ocean touches you all the time. And also, not just how the ocean affects us, but how we are impacting the ocean and how it relates to climate. The ocean governs climate, governs weather, home for most of life on Earth. We have a habit that continues from the earliest time that humans arrived on Earth, relatively recent in terms of life on Earth. But we consume nature. We consume the water. We consume the wildlife, the trees, the fish, whatever it is. And we have regarded nature as free goods. The ocean is an open grocery store where you don't have to pay for things. You just have to get there and take. And that's been the attitude about trees as well, and all of nature. But the great change now, and I'm a witness to this, that now we know what we could not know even half a century ago, even 10 years ago. We're getting better at understanding how everything connects. And this is a moment in time when we have the last best chance we will ever have to reach that goal of a place for ourselves within the natural systems that make our existence possible. Call it sustainability, if you will. And it's really exciting to see companies such as Rethinking, but really making that just a centerpiece of the nature of, a business has to make a profit, but you can also make a difference in a positive way. We need to, and big companies are chiming in now with sustainability officers and departments that didn't exist 50 years ago. We're beginning to see, but we need to amp it up, and we need to hurry. And I love the fact that there are women leaders really making a difference, bringing something that isn't unique to women, but it's, I think, more a part of who we are as women, to have compassion, to have an empathy for life, an empathy for one another, and making that part of the bottom line. That it's what we like to think of as humane, to understand not just where we are, and to think of how others, to put ourselves in the place of others, but to do that for the living world as well, and empathy for nature. It helps us find our place.
When you talk about females, leading the pack on this kind of change, Brienne is definitely one of them. She was actually named Global Thinker by Foreign Policy back in 2016 for her initiatives. And by the way, she started this as a student, which is even more impressive that she went. And she attracted the highest number of female investors in Pledge Me's history, which is incredibly amazing. Brienne, what have you sort of learned through this process of seeking funding and trying to create this this environmentally sustainable company?
We have equity crowdfunded twice before raising money the more conventional way. And from those initial equity crowdfunding raises, where we did have the highest number of women ever, it was very apparent how important purpose is to every single last one of them. Product's a product. It's not something to get overly excited about. It's a sustainable alternative, great. But the purpose behind the company to inspire other companies to do better, to rid the world of plastic bottles. You know, we've saved 13 million plastic bottles thus far. The next goal is 500 million by 2030. Those are the sorts of things that inspire people to get behind your brand and behind your business. And that was what inspired people to invest in us early on. That has continued through as we have raised with more, with angel investors and then further on with VC and PE firms. It rather than being this disadvantage that it's portrayed as, having a purpose that people can grip onto becomes part of your brand, and investors realize that. It is an enormous benefit to have a truly purpose-led company. It makes everything easier. It gives you more to talk about. It gives more people it engenders greater loyalty from both investors and customers. And if you are absolutely true to those values and you make it incredibly clear to whoever works with you that you will not change, then it never ever becomes a problem. And continually ask how we manage to scale without changing those values or watering them down. And it's just never been on the table. No one has ever asked me to, because I've always made it clear from day one that I am completely immovable there. We are what we are, and we will only get better and add more to the company, but we will never downgrade what we do just to make more money. That is absolutely nothing we will ever do.
Yeah, I can see your passion, so I can see that you absolutely would not cross that line, and you're standing firmly in that. I love that. I absolutely love that. You know, Sylvia, Brienne is trying to do something that could help transform the environment. When you look at ocean ecosystem protections, is it the same as protections for land ecosystems?
Basically, it is. And there is now a widely embraced concept of protecting and restoring and protecting at least 30% of the land and at least 30% of the ocean in the next 10 years. I say at least because we can't just trash 70% and expect that we can prosper on 30% of the natural systems that maintain Earth as a habitable place in a universe that is really not very friendly. Just imagine trying to set up housekeeping for 8 billion people on the moon, starting from scratch, which is what it is. They have rocks, a little bit of water. We have a living ocean. We have a living planet that is still the best chance that we have to have a prosperous future, to have a future at all. We must see ourselves as a part of nature, not apart from it. Where would we be without, first of all, the history, 4.5 billion years of fine-tuning the natural systems, and over the last million years, even the last 10,000 years, coming to a point that we all now share, the Anthropocene, starting in about 1950. And geologists mark this as a time that is written in stone. Our impact on the world is there. The explosion of nuclear devices, the plastics that now infuse the planet that didn't exist before in abundance until about 1950. And here we are. Some of us have our roots in a previous geological time, but are now living with everyone in the 21st century. And what geologists have acknowledged is the Anthropocene, with human impacts on our life support system, the natural world, dominated by the ocean. And if we didn't know that superpower of knowing, we would be in much worse condition than we are. But now we kind of get it. We have to take care of the air, of the water, of the wild creatures that make this biogeochemical miracle Earth possible. And it's our time. We are maybe the luckiest generation, the people who've ever existed in all of history. Because if we didn't know, we would keep doing what our predecessors have always done, and that is consume, consume, consume nature, as if we'll never run out. But we're the lucky ones. We can see that if we keep going, 90% of the tunas, 90% of the sharks, gone. Whales, however, are recovering. Why? Because we got it. If you keep killing whales just endlessly, they'll be gone. And then what? Now we value whales and they are recovering. Turtles in the ocean. There are more of them today than when I was a kid. We've stopped, generally speaking, killing turtles on the scale we used to. We don't eat the eggs as much as once we did. And we can restore, we can see that when you protect the land, that birds can thrive. When you protect the ocean and really protect places where you let the turtles and the fish prosper, then we prosper as well.
One of the things I love about doing these foreign policy live events is it gets like-minded people who really are passionate about issues to be engaged and look at issues. But they're also passionate about moving this on to everyday folks around the world. Brianne, you're doing something, as I brought up those shampoos and potions from my bathroom to make the point that this is something all of us have an impact, a carbon footprint on every day, no matter where you live. Brianna, you were talking sort of about helping transform these big companies that are producing all these plastics. Dr. Earle explained the ecosystem and how fragile it can be. Where do you see the most hope in making that effort?
Changing consumers and change what Dr. Earle has been saying. Now we know we can demand better. By demanding better, we will get the change that we need. So the more education we get out there, the more understanding people have of how critical and how urgent this problem really is, and all these variety of environmental issues, that is how we will change. I honestly believe that the fastest way to create mass positive change is through business and industry, simply because you think of all the resources in terms of people and literally finance that business has at its disposal. We change business and we take it from this idea that profit at all costs and move it to one that a business is obligated to have a responsibility to people and to planet. Think of the difference we can make. Think of the change we can make. I believe that by transforming business, we will create change which you've never seen before, and we can do it quickly. But we've just got to create the need to do so within business leaders who perhaps haven't seen that themselves. And there's plenty of examples I can think of. And the way to do that is to get consumers to demand more and to start voting with their dollar. The best thing you can do, of course, is to not buy stuff you don't need. But after that, go and talk to brands, go and inspire them to do better and demand that they do better. I believe that's the number one thing you can do as an individual to impact your carbon footprint and other environmental issues.
That's the power of your purse. That definitely does have weight in these type of issues. Dr. Earle, when you look at sustainability, why isn't it really a long-term solution for climate change?
There are things we can do right now that will have a magnified impact, but we just have to understand the carbon cycle, which sounds like that's pretty nerdy, but actually it's carbon dioxide that in excess is warming the planet, is causing the ocean to become more acidic. As excess carbon dioxide becomes carbonic acid in the ocean, it's changing the chemistry of the ocean, changing the chemistry of the planet. It's on our watch during the last half century, 50 years. The next 50 years, the next 10 years will really shape everything that follows. It's our time. It's our choice every day about what we wear, what we eat, how we travel. It really does come down to each person. No one can do everything. Everyone can do something, either by what we do or what we fail to do. We're making a difference. times nearly 8 billion, it really adds up. So I look at the marketplace, the choices we make, and I've got my new supply of Ethique products, by the way. I can't wait to try them out. But
quite the endorsement.
Yeah, well, it's true. But think about, some people say we're eating our way to extinction through agriculture, our habit of eating animals on such a scale, and what it takes to make the animals that we eat, big carbon footprint, big water footprint. Once you know, you can make better choices and you feel good about it. Eating wildlife from the ocean is a habit, but we're eating things from the ocean that no one consumed when I was a child, like the deep sea fish, orange roughy, Chilean sea bass, so-called, and other deep sea creatures, and even tuna. Tuna were consumed historically by a few people in a few places, but now it's everywhere. It's marketing that makes it possible for us to incorporate these things into our diet. We think it's always been that way. No, it's a new phenomenon to take wildlife from the ocean on the scale. We're talking, over the years, we've taken hundreds of millions, even billions of wild animals out of the ocean that were never on our menu historically, but we have put them there and we can now take them off our menu because they're carbon-based units. They are. International Monetary Fund puts $1 trillion value on whales alone in terms of the carbon and their effect on climate. Live whales help keep carbon in the ocean and provide nutrients for the phytoplankton that generates oxygen and captures carbon. And it's true with tunas too. If whales are carbon-based units that affect climate, imagine if we could keep tuna in the ocean, capturing carbon and providing nutrients to drive the cycle of life. And I think women get the cycle of life business a whole lot more readily because it becomes kind of personal with us. It should be with guys too. And it's true that we're all part of this, but it's understanding how we fit in to, dare I say, the carbon cycle, that we are elements of change in either consuming our life support system or embracing it with care and understanding that this is our time. We can use the knowledge that now exists to make better choices, critically important choices, to take us from this seemingly inexorable decline into recovery and then real sustainability for us as humans, as a part of this living miracle, our home, mostly blue planet.
I love that. But I do have to say, Dr. Earle, you've forever ruined tuna for me. And I love tuna, but now you've made me more aware. And once you've moved out of ignorance, you can't unsee those things. So I say thank you. You've got a question here. I'm going to pose this final question to both of you before we wrap up. Someone's asking, how are you working with other businesses or suppliers across the supply chain to advocate and incentivize more sustainable practices? Brianne, do you want to take that? And then I'll let Dr. Earle have a shot.
Okay.
Sure. So every supplier, distributor, retailer, whoever we work with, we try and understand where they are at in their sustainability or regeneration journey. And most of the time they're at those beginning stages, and you know what, it's fine. A step at a time is the really important bit there. So we try and explain what we've been doing, what's worked well for us, and pass on any learnings we've made. But we also put a little bit of sometimes gentle, sometimes firm encouragement to move into doing better. So a great example would be our US warehouse is making steps to become the largest completely plastic-free warehouse in the USA. And they expect to transition that over the next 6 to 8 months, which would never have happened had they not understood why it was so important to use materials that will compost, or that will certainly much more quickly biodegrades than plastic, which of course doesn't biodegrade at all, but in fact just degrades into microplastics. Those are the sorts of initiatives that scale impact well beyond what a tech will ever do and reach far more businesses. And that is probably the most exciting bit of a tech for me, is inspiring other businesses who are much bigger than us to make those changes. And that simply comes about as a way of educating why you should do something and why it matters, because you always start with why, and then how. How do you do it? Because some of these things can come across as impossible to implement for such established businesses. But every business can do something if you just take that first step.
The why and the how, so important. Dr. Earl, we've got a few seconds left, but I'd love for you to weigh in on how we get companies involved.
As individuals, companies also have choices. And as individuals, companies have the power to make a difference, and with an ethic that the bottom line must not just be dollars, it must also be working within the natural systems that maintain our existence. So there are companies. The message I tend to give is account for nature properly. Nature is not like free goods, whether it's fish or air or water. We need to think differently about what value is, and it's not just cost, it's the real value, the living value of maintaining a system that respects the natural world. And there are companies like Ethique that are taking it on, but I see the sustainability concept, but we just need to take it really seriously. And the word greenwashing, blue washing, whatever it is, we just have to get over that and be real. And companies, Rolex is a company that is investing in, has that ethic of caring, giving back. And I see Citibank as another company that is really taking seriously the importance of investing in ways, call it impact investing if you will, but impacting in ways that keep us safe in a universe of not very friendly options.
Dr. Sylvia Earle and Brianne West. Brianne, tell us again how we can find your products. Is it on your website?
Yeah, so ethique.com, ETHIQUE.
I'll be ordering some. Thank you both so much for this engaging conversation and for making us very aware. I want to bring on Senior Vice President for Strategic Development, Diana Marrero. Diana, I've learned so much over the past 2 days. And I mean, the tuna part today from Dr. Earle has forever changed my diet.
Absolutely, me too. I love tuna rolls.
Same here.
I think that. But thank you so much, Rena, and thank you, Dr. Earle and Brianne. Really enjoyed hearing that conversation. And this brings us to the end of our plenary program on today for Her Power 2021. I want to take a minute to thank our partners today. The collective of the 5 Nordic embassies, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. ASU's Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. ASU's Thunderbird School of Global Management, Ethique, Hologic, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If you missed any part of the event, we have recorded the conversations and we'll post them on our event website through foreignpolicy.com/events. And don't forget to join our breakout sessions at 12 p.m. Eastern and keep the conversation going on social media using the hashtag HerPower2021. I'm also happy to share that Foreign Policy has 2 exciting events coming up. Just tomorrow, please join us for a virtual dialogue addressing the root causes of climate migration, where we'll be exploring the growing migrant population due to climate change and how governments and organizations are working together to develop programs and investments to foster local capacity for confronting challenges like changing climate patterns and extreme weather. On November 10th, we'll take a deep dive into the future of digital currency and crypto's impact on global finance. Maggie Lake will join a fantastic roster of experts to take a look at the development of cryptocurrency and how it can contribute to a more democratic and equitable financial system. On November 17th, FP hosts our inaugural Tech Forum, where we'll examine technology's impact on the world, its influence on society, geopolitics, multilateralism, and global business, and the challenges and opportunities that technology brings about in international affairs. Finally, please stick around for an opportunity to connect with leaders and mentors in our breakout sessions, starting in just a moment at noon Eastern Time, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Check your email inbox for links to the breakouts, and the available session links will also be posted on this webpage shortly. The sessions will focus on the gender dimensions of climate change with Sarah Levitt from the Nature Conservancy, Laura Garcia, President and CEO of the Global Green Grants Fund. We'll also be hosting a conversation on technology and innovation for gender equality with Shada Badi at Data2X and Emily Sharp at the World Wide Web Foundation. And last but not least, we'll be discussing gender-based violence with Reem Al-Salem, a UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and Cecilia Mandu of the International Association of Women in Radio and Television. Thank you again, and see you online for our upcoming events and again next year for Her Power 2022. Thank you.